Good afternoon, everybody. Having spent a day and a half looking at conifers, I'm really going to be talking about broadleaves, okay? Which is one of the issues that Scott raised just now, is about how do we deal with oaks. This is going to be particularly pertinent for those interested in managing oak in a continuous cover fashion. Right at the start of this conference, you heard the words of His Royal Highness giving great support to the approach of CCFG in all its guises across Britain. He's a passionate advocate of it. And Geraint, who some of you will know, sitting there at the back, had been undertaking continuous cover forestry in the conifer context in the Cornish estate for the last 18 years. In 2000, the Duchy made a significant acquisition in land of 28,000 acres, bought an institutional land holding, the core of which was actually in Herefordshire, where I happen to be, and the core of the woodlands on that estate happened to be broadleaf. So it was no surprise to me, at one sense, that when I met up with Geraint and we'd been instructed, that they said, right, you're going to do some continuous cover forestry. We want it to be broadleaved as a counterbalance to the conifer resource in southwest England. We've seen over the last day, those of you who've been doing CCF will know that it's very, very important to understand local conditions. What I propose to do for the next few minutes is talk about the local conditions in Herefordshire that are very different to here. It was quite a relief just walking around the woodlands the last day or so, not getting snagged in bramble, and just being able to enjoy looking at regeneration just happening. The bulk of the woodlands in Herefordshire that Duchy own are ancient, semi-natural woodland, and it makes sense in many ways for them to become broadleaf. So let's look firstly at those local conditions. That's just a picture of the Wye Valley and some of the woodlands on the brow there. On the brow there, those are Duchy woodlands. So, local conditions. The soil is exceptionally fertile. One of the reasons for the purchase, in fact, because it was the agricultural land they were really after. Very, very deep. The climate is probably the most equitable in the country, in my view. We don't get big extremes, and that soil, but because of the red colour, particularly the red nature of the soil, it warms up early in the spring, so we get early growth, long growing seasons. But of course, when you've got fertile soil, long growing seasons, equitable climate, you get competition and weeds galore. It was just rather nice seeing bracken down here. At the moment in Herefordshire, the bracken's here. By 2 weeks' time, it'll be here. The brambles are that high. The willow herb can be 10 foot by the end of the growing season. So what chance getting natural regeneration away through that? And observationally, over the last sort of 10 years before we decided to undertake CCFG on the estate, I'd observed that felling and trying to wait for regeneration to happen just was a complete and utter failure. The natural regeneration that did occur was sporadic, and specifically two of the species that really wanted to be growing, oak and chestnut. Oak would mast on a 7 to 10 year cycle. It would often disappear. Subsequently discovered that particularly sessile oak suffers from seborrhea infection, fungal infection, just wipes out the acorns once they land on the ground, or once their skin is compromised. And there's obviously lots of predation. The woods are full of mammals and mice and squirrels and deer. And actually, the success and achievement of success with oak as regeneration is really, really hard. With this fertile growth, once you get the trees established, comes fertile, good growing conditions. You get high sap flow. Sycamore and ash will be growing at yield class 12 to 14. We've got oak stands measuring yield class 12. It is very fertile conditions, but because of the high sap flow, it leaves the trees very susceptible to grey squirrel damage. We can have grey squirrel damage on trees 6 years old. It is very, very frustrating. The deer browsing pressure, as it is across much of lowland England, is quite high. We started off with fallow. Actually, we've now got two other species to deal with. One observation too was that we'd observed mixtures failing. In intimately planted mixtures, I'm going to say failing in objectives. So, my classic examples, you plant 10% cherry in a mix, it gets just scattered through. By year 10, that can be a 50% or 60% cherry wood. We've all seen it, but particularly where the growth is accelerated on really fertile sites. One of the features of lowland England, lowland woodlands, in fact, across the nation, is the declining workforce. And the system itself, I think, was pointed to a requirement to have more manual input than less. And yet, where were the people? The estate inherited two woodsmen. In fact, they've increased the number of woodsmen on the estate to 4. The one thing I had observed up to that point, though, was that group selection had worked on a modest basis, on an experimental basis for a number of clients. So with those in mind, what were going to be the prerequisite management tools? Well, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, grey squirrel control. We can have arguments about spacing and species and thinning densities and structures and all the rest of it, but if we fail to get a grey squirrel control right, it's all a failure. If you're trying to grow timber, it's all a failure. So we had to adjust that, and we've moved from a warfarin-based system to one that involves a lot of trapping and quite a bit of shooting. Deer control 2 was essentially, if we were wanting to at least try and work with some regeneration, and where we were having to plant, then actually getting deer populations down was quite important. And also to make the natural processes and the intrinsic use of coppice in the system was very reliant on making sure there weren't enough deer to mow the coppice off, as well as the trees we were trying to grow. Clearly, many of the stands hadn't been managed with CCF in mind beforehand, but we knew that if we were going to at least try and secure some regeneration and promote seeding, we were going to need to develop the canopy. And so hence, graduated density thinning, or it was, I can't remember what the FC term this morning was, seed feed tree, whatever it was, can't remember what it was. There's also recognition that natural regeneration alone would probably fail, and that we would have to do a mix of strategic planting and work with the regeneration as it comes. As I say, we increased the staff numbers. There's now 4 woodsmen on the estate. Being responsive, and I think something that Scott alluded to, the skill sets to deliver it, particularly in the lowlands, are quite high, in my opinion. And we need to make sure that these men and women who are doing it understand the system and can react and respond accordingly. And the last point there about understanding species interactions. Someone yesterday mentioned the fact that who's got experience in managing mixtures. Herefordshire has a great tradition of mixtures, conifer, broadleaf, 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 conifer, conifer. I manage a lot of mixtures, so if you want some advice, I can help you. But actually, understanding that in a CCF context is often different from a high forest system, and that's something we're still learning on. So, what silvicultural system were we going to adopt? We considered single tree selection. I thought it wouldn't work. A lot of people were kind of suggesting that we might try it. And it was interesting yesterday to hear about Lowther's experience with shade-tolerant species being suitable for single tree selection. Actually, most of the species we're working with are light demanders, and therefore they need light, and therefore single tree selection probably wasn't going to be appropriate. Shelterwood system, both irregular and regular. Well, we don't get abundant seeding. How on earth is a shelterwood kind of system going to function? So we dispatched that one. And really, because of the experience working with group selection that had worked on a modest scale, we said, right, okay, we're going to do this larger scale. So it is, as Scott alluded to, an irregular group selection system. And there's two things to define about the groups. Firstly, the selection is defined by the maturity of the crop, the marketability of the crop, i.e. target dimension, and the species concerned. So for example, we might have a sort of compartment of 0.3 of a hectare of poplar. We're not going to be using poplar for continuous cover purposes. I don't really want to be growing poplar. They were the easy stands to say, well, actually, why not just create a group here and start to regenerate it or plant it, because that was what was going to be necessary. In addition to the sort of the target dimension approach, we would define the groups by much more in accordance with the size of the wood. So, for example, a 0.3 hectare felling and a 0.4 hectare wood is probably not a great group size. But a 0.5 or 0.6 hectare felling and 150 hectare wood is kind of fine. You're still getting shelter. You're still getting the benefits of that sort of continuous approach. All of these things were pointing to what I would describe so that people can understand is a twin track approach between a proactive, that positive, right, we recognise we're not going to get any regeneration here. We are going to have to fell and plant the mix that we want and then manage it. And then hopefully over time, as we start to manipulate the stand elsewhere, we might be able to start to work with it more in a natural kind of way. But also recognising that there were pockets of regeneration. They're very infrequent, but if we can work with them. Let's be responsive and a sort of reactive approach. So twin track approach, proactive, reactive. And I'll show you some slides in a little while about that. All the other stands are plantations of various ages, and I put plantations in mind. Some of the 140-year-old oak stands, designated as ancient woodland, everybody will look at it thinking marvellous ancient woodland, which they are actually oak plantations. The oak dominance that we have in Herefordshire is really an artefact of man, because the decline of coppice in the 19th century meant that many landowners were sat there and saying, well, what do I do with this? Nobody wants to buy coppice. Well, we'll establish oak and ash and sometimes European larch plantations mixed. And you've ended up with an oak, even-aged high forest over a modest understory. So what have we achieved over the last 14 years? Well, I think all these good things that we believe about CCF, I can say we continue to see the benefits from. Enhanced growth rates, we're getting much more diverse habitats, wind throw is down, exposure is down, conservation benefits following through from killing deer and killing squirrels and managing the habitat delivers good coppice, funnily enough. It delivers good habitat for birds, it delivers good habitat for dormice. There have been sporting enhancements. Actually, when you go and talk to a game keeper and you say, I want to clear fell this 3 or 4 hectares of mature oak and it's going to ruin your stand, your drive, they're not very impressed. But if you say, well, actually, I'm going to put a few groups here and there, and by the way, at the top of the hill there's going to be some flushing point, they think, great, that's really good. Very important to the duchy are the last two elements. One, capital valuation. They're tasked with an Act of Parliament. They have to improve the valuation of the estate year on year if possible. That's what they've got to do. And actually, this has been really good. Admittedly, woodland values have gone up, but if you speak to Cleggs who come around and do the valuations, they say they're right at the top drawer. It's also important, positive PR, particularly for someone like the Duchy, but also important for Forestry Commission, also important for United Utilities and all the people we've been around. It is quite a good system to sell to the public. Well, what have we had to do to changes to forest management practices? I've already mentioned deer. Do we view them as an asset or a liability? I'm afraid we view them as a liability. We've got the population down. We've got a really, really good stalker who's a former SIS regiment member. They're based in Hereford. It's quite helpful sometimes. He is really good at taking out deer. I was walking down through a ride through a wood a couple of years ago, and the phone went, and he said, I picked it up and said, hello, and he said, headshot, 300 metres. He's a good guy. And we are seeing an increase in species. I've already mentioned that we started with fallow, actually roe and muntjac are trickling in, but we are keeping numbers down. The other benefit is that we are achieving this at a landscape scale, because not only do we look after the Duchy's woods, but we are look after neighbouring estate woodlands, and he's involved there as well, so we're really keeping a pressure on the population. We've had to understand and improve our harvesting techniques, both with coppice, relearn how to do coppicing properly. I've put mechanised plus down there. If you're trying to increase the level of coppice in the system, which we are, you don't want the harvester forwarded driver to drive over it and track it out, but somehow he needs to be able to get through. So the contract cutters are often working ahead of the harvesters. The harvesters can weave through and then possibly tidy up, because when you're dealing with broadleaves, they aren't always as straight and easy to get down as conifers. We've increased marking, specifically when you're in this sort of stand change scenario and when you're trying to preserve different features. And the skill sets, particularly for the contractors, when you're knocking over an oak tree of 300 hoppers foot, that's about 12 cubic metres, for those who don't know about hoppers feet. Trying to get that in the right way is quite an art. One of the issues I've mentioned about natural regeneration in frequency is specifically with oak and chestnut in Herefordshire. We want them to be there and part of the mix, and a dominant part of the mix. So because of the Sibora infection, we've started collecting our own oak from our own best trees, our own plus trees. And that's been quite a helpful process, because we've been picking from the better elements of the stand, growing them all in the nursery, and in the right conditions, a good acorn will deliver you a 60-90 seedling in a first year in a cell-grown tree. And if you do it with bare root as well, you can extend that sort of collection over 3 or 4 years. I mentioned FTT there. Those who aren't members of FTT or involved in it, shame on you. We're into tree breeding. Talk to me afterwards about it. Okay, so what are perspectives on CCFG in Herefordshire? Transformation in broadleaves is an exceptionally long process. I mean, we've been talking mainly conifer over the last few days. With broadleaves, it's just even longer. But it does provide a diverse and stimulating environment to work in. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It's exceptionally complex. Does add to the headaches occasionally. I'd say over the last 10 years, we've seen a reduction in regeneration costs. Per unit hectare, we've been working quite hard. And that's despite increasing our target for density. Because bear in mind, we want to achieve a clean 6-metre saw log. That's what the objective is. And the only way you get that with broadleaves is to grow them tight. So we started at 2,500 hectare. We're now planting at 3,500, supplementing that with a bit of regeneration, hopefully getting towards 4,000 stems per hectare. It is a slightly high-risk strategy. I would say that because both with grey squirrels and deer, you can turn your back and they're in again. And there have been some failures, I admit. We've had crops that have not done as well as what we anticipated. I mentioned this thing about post-MAI values. MAI, maximum mean annual increment. Many of the stands that we're transforming are taking the trees much longer than they really wanted to go. That's okay if you're growing oak and it's just growing slowly. Even oak that was growing your class 4, your class 8, slows down at the end of the rotation. But if your increment's 150, 200 pounds a cubic metre, then actually you're still adding 400, 500, 600 pound a hectare every year. That's okay. We've maintained our basal area, which I think is quite important when you're trying to protect the quality of the trees. It does rely on a high-value commodity. We have looked quite hard and been relatively successful improving coppice markers. I'm just going to show you a few pictures. This picture here shows a view looking upwards. That was 3 trees removed from that canopy. Those trees are about 32, 35 metres high. And there's not a lot of light in there. So that we planted that area. You can just begin to see, just in the centre, that tree in the middle is just about getting enough light. But that coop there doesn't get, hardly gets any direct sunlight. Just doesn't get it. So I don't think that coop is big enough. This is the kind of size coop that I think is appropriate for our light conditions. That's on the top of a hill. That's a 6-7-year-old stand now, planted at 2,500 stems per hectare, supplemented with a little bit of birch, a little bit of ash. We left some seed trees of ash on the edge. Planted a little bit more coppice in there because there didn't happen to be much coppice species. But that's growing away. That's kind of perfection, if you like. You can get multiple areas of that scattered across woodlands. That's brilliant. I haven't got any time to talk about that. For those of you who have never seen grey squirrel damage to fast-grown broadleaves, that's what it does. That's why I get pretty cheesed off that. That's effectively been ring-barked. So the suggestion from the FSC that we go and treat these trees up in the air, you saw that in the derogation, I'm afraid made me a bit irritated. I'll talk about a reactive process. This happened to be an area pocket where we happened to see a small amount of quite dense oak regeneration. So I reacted, said, right, let's clear off the canopy. So now that's about 7 or 8 years on. You can just see the oak regeneration in the back there. There's a little bit of birch come in here. This is just still bramble thicket, but that's kind of okay. That's working. Just some, again, reacting to natural regeneration that happened to appear on the edge of the woods. A bit of respacing has delivered that. Again there, that was a pocket of regeneration just here. About 6-7 years ago, it's about the height of my car. Removed a couple of trees over here, and you're now there. This is an area which we decided to plant quite densely at 5-foot spacing. We're in tall shelters. There it is now, 7 or 8 years on. And again, highlight the issue of light. It's classic textbook stuff, but the tallest trees are in the middle. What we've decided to do is plant a lot more shade-bearing species, and particularly understory species around the edges. Just don't expect to grow an oak tree there under that drip line. This is just a comparison. Let me go there. On the left is a planted tree from our own collection. That's an oak tree aged 4 years old. There's my wax jacket. I'm about that high. It's about 10, 12 feet high. That was planted at 2,700 stems per hectare. We've got some supplementary natural regeneration in there. On the right there is that 8-9-year-old natural regeneration. A little bit denser, shorter. Quality difference between the two. I think I prefer that. These trees are not, they're struggling a bit, possibly because they haven't got quite enough light. But actually the quality of the surrounding stand wasn't that great, whereas I know the quality in that stand from those trees is good. Okay, my last point really. All of this system, making it work, relies completely on growing things that we can sell like that. That's an oak tree. That's worth about £1,500, £1,800. But unless I achieve that objective of securing that quality stem at enough density across a large enough proportion of the wood, and we won't be able to pay for all those other things. We're now paying for our deer control, we're paying for squirrel control, we're paying for all the other sort of coppice and all the other environmental benefits that flow through the system. But fundamentally, we've got to be growing these and those. So if I encourage you, particularly, it's come through over the last day or so about conifers and the importance of making sure we manipulate the stands to make sure those trees deliver quality. I think very occasionally, sometimes we seem to get lost with broadleaves. That's kind of there as a sort of sop to biodiversity. If you're trying to grow these things, you must think about your end objective and get everything in place to deliver that end objective. And if you fail on that, you'll never achieve your objective. Okay.